So I'm going to try not to drag this out. The first thing I want to say is that Rob defeated himself in his closing argument by correctly pointing out that we had better hush up about this subject. We had better not let the women hear us talking about it, because if we do, the first thing they'll do is use their tyrannical female voting power to prevent us from using our First Amendment rights. They'll kick us off the internet and they won't let us talk anymore. And he has every right to be afraid of female tyranny, since women are historically responsible for the expansion of government in all areas, especially concerning social welfare by a large margin, with that social welfare accounting for over 60% of the voting gap between men and women. So if you want small government, Rob, the very best way to make sure you'll never have it again is to let every woman vote. Now, second point real quick is that you were talking about, immutable characteristics, that you don't think women should be excluded simply based on sex because they can't change that. Do you believe that every woman should be obligated to sign up for the draft at age 18?
No.
Why not?
Because I think, and I tried to answer this earlier, but I think that there is a difference. Giving someone a positive right that says you have a right to have your voice heard in government is different than the purpose of a draft, which is in emergency situations. Right.
So you're fine with discriminating against men based on an immutable characteristic, i.e. making them sign up for the draft at age 18 just because they are male, even though they can't change that?
Well, no, because I think that in general, yes, but let me articulate, there would be certain specific incidents, such as a male's inability through health reasons, whatever. If they can't, I'm not saying that we should take any paraplegic and throw them into the front lines, but I'm saying there is a difference between saying that someone should have the right to vote or a right to have input in the government, because they're putting things into the government as well, such as their taxation, their labor, their raising of children, their giving away of their fathers and their husbands. They're sacrificing things in that as well. That's different than a pragmatic solution to needing a draft.
But we can send people to die based on their sex. That's fine. Okay,
correct.
Got that. That clears that up for me. And then the final thing I just wanted to mention was, we've talked a lot about voting rights, but this was supposed to be about women's lib in general. And I wonder, Rob, if you are aware of the outcomes of almost 100 years of women's liberation. Let me just give you a couple of them real quick. If you look at just numbers, everybody loves numbers. Back in 1960, 72% of all American adults were married. Today, that number is only 50%. In 1960, out-of-wedlock births only accounted for 5% of all births. Today, that number is 41%. Welfare spending in 1950, adjusted for inflation, was about $50 billion a year. And as soon as women came out and started to vote en masse and join the workforce, now that number is $700 billion a year. It rose exactly in lockstep with women's sexual liberation and out-of-wedlock births. And the number of children under 6 with full-time working mothers in 1940 was only 6%. Today, that number is 58%, meaning that in 2016, 20% of all U.S. households spent more than a quarter of their income on childcare. The average time for children enrolled in daycare per week is 35 hours. 26% of all American adult women are on at least one psychiatric drug. And 1/3 of all children living in the United States today are living in a home without their biological father, putting them at massive risk for things like homelessness, admission to psychiatric hospitals, behavioral disorders, abuse treatment centers, being in a juvenile correctional facility. And children living in a home without both biological married parents are more likely to be subjected to all types of abuse by a factor of at least 8 times. That number goes up depending on the situation. So, after 100 years of this, are you still going to tell me that with all the harm and damage done to children, done to women and men, done to liberty and freedom, done to the structure of the government you want so badly to be small and less invasive, do you still think that overall it's worth it?
Yes, for 2 reasons. One, it goes back to the first point you made that I didn't respond to yet, which is that we have to be pragmatic in our approach. So even if I concede your argument, it's because I bring up women's tyranny that would vote against these things if we start to talk about it. That still means that the desired outcome would be less likely, which means the approach we should be taking to solve all of the terrible things you just talked about need to be done so in a way that has the best chance to achieve the desired outcome. And if we're doing something that we know would achieve the exact opposite outcome, even if you think it's because they're shitty people that are easily misled and that will use their tyranny, it's still something that pragmatically we should seek to avoid. The second thing is, I think that there's a problem, although I think that you're going to be spot on the data that how women vote. Couldn't you do that with other groups? For example, I think it wasn't legally until 1870 that blacks had the right to vote in this country. Yet if we started at that point and looked at all that same data, the numbers might not be as stark, but they would still be stark that many of those things have been incredibly rapidly deteriorating. My question to you then is, if we could show that blacks tend to vote for bigger government and things like that, would you think that they should also not have the right to vote based on their race because it led to these worse outcomes?
No, and the reason for that is the same as what the answer would be that I would give to the use of force argument when you say, well, what if blacks can't defend their rights against, white men because their numbers are smaller or something like that? It's because if you look at every demographic, regardless of race, religion, class, socioeconomic status, the woman question is the big defeater. So you can look at different cross sections of different voting groups, and there will be differences among like the men. So for instance, like black men versus Asian women could all be very different. But women as a whole are, number one, the largest voting bloc, and they are firmly in the camp of Democrats and have been since 1980. So if you just take away like the racial, all the other differences, it doesn't matter if you're a black woman, an Indian woman, a Christian woman, an atheist woman. The only thing where there's a little bit of wiggle room is married women do tend to be slightly more conservative. But unfortunately, married women are in the minority now. So no, it still doesn't stand to reason to divvy things up that way, because it doesn't matter what color you are. If you're a woman, you're going to vote for less rights and more government.
So I just real quick, I know that there's probably a bunch of other callers. There's two criticisms I have with this. One, it seems now that there's a threshold argument. I'm not positive of this, but I'm guessing if I pulled up a map of the 2020 election and could somehow get the data to show if only black men voted, probably still would be overwhelmingly blue, which would mean that many of these same positions. So you seem to be saying, yeah, but it's worth with women. Maybe true, but if it means that women lead to bad outcomes and these black men would lead to bad outcomes only slightly less worse than women, then intuitively it would imply that we should also take away their right to vote, because the immutable characteristic argument seems to be thrown out the window with you. You're like, you don't care about that. You're only concerned about the utilitarian outcome. And second, that gets to my second... Well, just real quick, let me say, because I think that and this will be a direct response you'll have to this, is the question of the ought, right? You're looking at it right now through a utilitarian framework and saying, if they do this, these are the bad outcomes we see. But does this answer the question of, ought we be allowed to restrict people's right to vote based on immutable characteristics like sex or race?
I think we should be able to restrict people's right to vote based on not only immutable characteristics, but a lot of other things. So, like, I'm not in any way for universal suffrage. I'm for like as much as you could limit suffrage as possible is what I would be for. I'd be looking for every possible way I could to exclude every group and individual that I could possibly eliminate. So no, it's not that I'm coming at it from a utilitarian point of view. I do think the reason I brought up the draft question is because I felt you had a contradiction by saying we shouldn't do things based on immutable characteristics unless it's sending men to die in a war, and then it's fine.
You're also forgetting that like black men can get drafted, so I don't really know where you're going with that.
What I was gonna say next is the fact that women are the only group. Black men can, use force and they can be drafted and they're held responsible in a way that women are not. Women are the only group. It's specific only to women, not to race or religion or socioeconomic status. Women are the only group that can vote to use force they don't possess to send other people to fight in wars, to lock people in jail, to
and I have to leave the call, or we won't be able to get to all the callers.
Sure, no problem. Thanks, fellas.
Let you rebut. Go
ahead.
just
real quick. I don't know if Rachel can stay to answer, but Jim Bob can answer if he wants, since he debated. There is a question I have on the utilitarian calculus list, and I would have asked Rachel the same question, obviously, is let's invert this. Let's say that I could prove to you, like 100 years from now, let's say women don't have the right to vote for 100 years, and we're somehow still alive because we're damn healthy people. And so what we see is, through some other machinations, all this crazy crazy woke shit, blue shit starts appearing again. And I could prove to you, if we just leave women vote in these next 2 elections, they're super conservative now and they would have better values. Would you be okay with the women voting then? If they if they tipped the scales for the policies you wanted?
I mean, I don't think so. I would just stand on principle that the goal would be to just eliminate the vote and reduce it to men, and then from men you reduce it to Rob and myself and other people would debate. Well, okay, what are the preconditions for?
I would be interested what Rachel would think about that, because it seemed to be she was implying when she said restricted as much as possible that she was basically saying she just wants the desired outcomes that she thinks is best for the country.
Well, let me just counter the hypotheticals, right? So say sure, Rob, I would.
Okay.
Now, Rob, descriptively, if you found out hypothetically, that that would never happen, that women will never change their voting patterns no matter what, and you had a crystal ball to know that they were always going to vote this way no matter what, would you then be okay with limiting their vote?
No, I would still say.
Right. So you're at the mercy of the same argument, Rob.
But that's fine.
Utility.
But the question, argument.
So we're pattern recognition machines, right? Because we're pattern recognition machines, we look at this, we go, okay, we can clearly see the patterns and their reasoning behind why they vote the way that they vote. We can't actually predict the future since we can't make those future predictions on anything except current trends. Why would we not base whatever we do currently on the things which are going on right now that affect us in the negative way, especially for these rights things you keep appealing to, right?
Because what this is illustrated is, on the foundational principle, we have a disagreement where I'm saying that it is not outcomes desired that are influencing my choice. I believe that things ought to be the way they are because of some principle that's
you
not
wouldn't vote if it wasn't based around outcomes, dude.
You also don't believe that. You also don't believe that. Why? Because Rachel elucidated, and I did during the debate, that you're not consistent with immutable characteristics, because you admitted that you support the men being the primary goers to war and being drafted. And is that not an outcome-based deliberation?
No, there is a difference in what I said. I could repeat the answer if you want, that the idea of having people having a say in the government's different than in an emergency situation, having to get the best fighting force possible. I also said that there are selective times where maybe you actually would, after the men were expended, still need to draft the women. If all the women are gone, you may still need to draft women to do that.
Rob, what I stated is that ultimately you're appealing to future predictive outcomes, which means that you're willing to use immutable characteristics to determine that men are drafted and women aren't.
Yes.
And it's based on the knowledge or the inductive reasoning that men will produce a better outcome in war, right?
Correct.
Okay.
That's different than saying that people need to, in an emergency situation, we need to do something's different than saying in a default situation in this country that women shouldn't have the right to vote. Because I want to get back real quick to what Andrew said there is what we see is that it's not that I'm using utilitarian framework. It's actually you that's using the utilitarian framework, because you're saying based on the outcomes is how you would decide whether or not women should vote. I'm saying even if it led to outcomes that I don't desire, that I still think they should have that right.
Well, I would say you could use both. You could use both at the same time.
I'll bring on the next caller. I want to make sure Rob got the last word.